Yes. So, again, a very warm welcome to all of you today. Thank you very much for taking the time to attend this masterclass session of the University of York Management School. Today we have a very special guest speaker. I will introduce the speaker first, and then I will just hand over to Dr. Michailidou. So today we are joined by the Deputy Minister of Labour and Social Affairs in Greece, Dr. Domna Maria Michailidou. The talk will be about the social policy and public administration during and after COVID-19, problems, challenges, and solutions. So as you can see, it's a very relevant topic. And I think you will all agree that we wouldn't have better insights today from this speech from our guest speaker. And I will also be joined from my dear colleague, Dr. Adonios Roubakis, who is a senior lecturer in comparative social policy. Adonios will handle later on the Q&A session and will moderate the discussion. Before we start, let me just introduce the speaker. So Dr. Domna Maria Michailidou is the Deputy Minister of Labour and Social Affairs in Greece, responsible for social welfare and social solidarity. Dr. Michailidou is an academic economist working on economic development and financial crisis. She has been a reforms advisor to the Prime Minister, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, on a series of issues related to structural reforms and financial markets. She worked for the OECD in Paris and Athens. Between 2010 and 2016, she taught several courses on macroeconomics and economic development at the University of Cambridge and UCL's School of Public Policy. Dr. Michailidou holds an MPhil and a PhD on financial and development economics from the University of Cambridge. And I will add here that Dr. Michailidou is also a York alumni from the Department of Economics. So I will just stop sharing my screen now. And I would like just to invite Dr. Michailidou to join us with her camera whenever she feels okay to talk to us. So hello, and again, welcome. First of all, thank you so much for your time. We can understand all how busy your schedule is, and I want you to know that we much appreciate the time you take to dedicate 45 minutes, 1 hour with us today. And also I would like just to share with you that we were looking so much forward to having you here today. And Dr. Michailidou, dear Minister, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invite, and thank you very much for making me think of my undergraduate days, and with the little hope or the warm hope that next time I will be with you up in York. For the time being, a warm good evening from Athens, where the weather has started getting a bit cold here as well. It's right. I spent my undergrad years in York. I read economics. It was one of the best period of my life. I remember all the cold nights in York, how the university campus was small, and it was at least a third of the size that it has now, because quite a lot of time has passed. But in any case, it was a time of tender memories. It was a time of great academic endeavors. And it's a time that I recall very often with very, very warm feelings. So I automatically and very, very quickly accepted the invite from your side and wanted to make sure that I made some time within my schedule in order to make this happen and make this happen with a lot of enthusiasm from my side. I'm not sure how interesting what I'm going to say is going to be, but I hope for the best. I thought what would interest students of social policy, and as I saw in the quick poll that you made, people from the industry and some from the civil sector as well. I think how I'm going to speak to you is a bit briefly on what it means to be involved in a ministry, what it means to be a deputy minister in terms of public administration and the management of public administration. Then a little bit on the challenges that we have and how, in my mind, different ministries have different challenges, and the type of challenges that we faced during COVID, And on top of that, how, and in my ministry, we managed to engage into reforms that came on top of the reforms that my ministry engaged into within these 10 years of the Memoranda of Understanding here in Greece, and how these, with an enhanced difficulty given the pressure of COVID, managed to get through and be actually implemented. So with regards to the first, with regards to what it means to be a minister, I think that perhaps it's not the most hardworking job in the planet, because everyone who works in high levels of administration works really long hours, more than 12, 13, more than 14 hours a day. I think that this happens in most jobs with high responsibilities nowadays, but it's certainly the most multivariable job in the planet. And I'm saying so because and I'm saying so as an economist as well, because it's a job that comprises an equation whose variables, first, you do not know from the beginning, as they complete and that they completely change all the time as a shear of variables. And then you do not know for sure the weight of each variable, and the weight also changes. So you have an equation of several different variables, and I will explain what I mean by variables in this, who you do not know from the beginning, and also you do not know the exact weight that they have at every specific moment. And what do I mean variables? When you are on top of the management of public administration, and I'm Deputy Minister of Labor and Social Affairs, what I am is that I'm completely responsible for all the social affairs. It's a ministry here in Greece that has the labor side, aka employment legislation. It has pensions and pension reform, and it also has social policy. Social policy has to do with the protection of the most vulnerable, whether these are children by the very concept of them not being adults, whether it's third age, whether it's disability, but of course, whether this is low income as well. So going back to what I mean by several variables, you have the variable of legislation. So the variable of legislation means primary and secondary legislation. How does one form legislation? You form legislation by understanding what happens in your own country, studying hard the already existing legislation, and then, because you do not need to reinvent the wheel, study what happens in other countries as well, in order to bring in your country reforms which are much needed, but also very much tested as well. So the first thing has to do with primary and secondary legislation, which is one variable. And then you do not understand the weight of this variable, because it's hard to have the symmetry of information on what domestic and external knowledge is. Second variable could be the institutions that are under your jurisdiction. These are, as a pyramid, of course, your team, the ministerial team that you are responsible for. They are the public institutions that you run and oversee. For example, the largest institution that is under my jurisdiction is the National Solidified Benefits Institution, which is by budget the third largest institution of the country after the pensions institution and the pharmaceutical payment institution, EFCA and LP, for example. And then there are all the other institutions that you control, you legislate, you finance, but they are under the private sphere or the NGO sphere of management. And then, of course, there are all these completely private institutions that you regulate and you certify. So there is, and especially in social affairs, there is a great array, a great portfolio of institutions for which you are responsible for as different stakeholders in the puzzle of your own management, that it's very hard to balance. And at different times, their relative weight in policy making changes as well, because especially during a pandemic and especially during a time of crisis right now, they have much more leverage, much more legitimate claims, and many more things to be asking us about. So you have the variable of all the institutions that directly or indirectly you supervise, you finance, and you regulate. Then there is a variable of the opposition. The variable of the opposition has to do with the external opposition, other parties, but it also has to do with internal opposition, things that you might not expect, things that you think that you're doing the right thing, but in some village, in some region, in some vested interest, either within the parliament or within your own party, they seem to be annoying people. So you need to judge this by each specific case study. And then you also have the variable, which is a very difficult one, of communication. And as in the variable of opposition, you have two sectors, the internal and the external. In the variable of communication, you have the passive and the active one. The passive is making sure that things that should not be reflected in the way other agents want to be portraying them take place. So making sure that you push externally bad communication on things you do on the way that you feel rightly, but they're not portrayed as such. And then it's active communication, which means that you need to make sure that all the reforms that you engage to, all these actions that you think that you're designing and implementing for all the right reasons, they're communicated in an efficient and in an effective way for people. So this is the first part of what I mean that being in policy making and being a minister is the most complex and multivariable equation that I think that can exist in the job market. Now, when it comes to ministries, I think from my brief experience here, there are two types of ministries. There are the ministries like the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, like the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Education, and perhaps the Ministry of Finance that you really need to run to stay still. So it's at times you do not have the luxury of reform because there are so many things in your daily life that need to take place in order just not to fail people. When it comes to social affairs and your people are the most vulnerable in society, then at times you just really need to run a marathon in sprint gear in order not to fall. So there are the other types of ministries like, let's say, external economic affairs or digitalization and digital reform, where each type of reform that you bring about makes a big change and a big impact on people's lives. However, the absence of such is not detrimental. It might be detrimental in the business development of the country, but it's not detrimental as in you allow the hospitals to fail, you allow the primary schools to fail, or even worse, you allow institutions that provide accommodation to disabled people, to homeless, to orphans without adequate resources. Now, what we did in the times of COVID. In the times of COVID, us together with the ministries that I think that I described, so Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, of course, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Finance, and perhaps to a less degree so the Ministry of Education, we had really, really hard work to do. And this is because we needed to make sure that especially the most vulnerable were completely shielded. In my ministry, we had the president of other European countries, such as Sweden, France, Spain, countries with welfare states which were very robust, welfare states that were very well financed, at least much better than ours, and that do exist for more than several decades now, almost busting. We had people of third age to disability to care homes that were dying the one after the other, to a degree that in some cases, in some countries like Sweden, for example, they were not counting old people deaths anymore. So really needed to make sure, especially given the characteristics of the Greek nuclear family, that our elderly did not die in institutions. This was the big responsibility. This was me in December 2020, that the PM called me and he was like, Domna, you need to make sure that we do not become another Sweden, because it's not just that the ministry is going to fail, the entire government is going to fail, and it will have a reason so, because we really need in Greece to make sure that the elderly do not die. Hence, we did a lot of work. We devised several protocols. We made sure that we provided all the assistance to the people in elderly homes with regards to masks, to robes, to everything they needed. We made sure that we made isolation rooms. We made sure that I talked with my colleagues in all the countries that did fail in protecting the elderly in order to devise the best protection for the elderly and the disabled. And to a very large degree, we made it. I think in Europe, we are the country that suffered the least losses in elderly homes. And this, of course, every loss really counts, but at least we can be, if you want, even nationally proud on this. But it was not just the elderly, it was kids, it was disability, and especially when it comes to disability, staying home is something which, and not attending special education schools, is something that takes you back decades, if not years. So devising protocols and the way that these people will not be treated in an unfair manner with regards to their livelihoods was something very hard to do, which again we made it. We made sure that we had daily tests there, that we sent free tests twice a week to these entities in order to make sure that in the beginning they worked for some months with 50% occupancy, but after that we made sure that they were the first institutions that opened in order for people with disabilities to be there and treated in a way that would only progress, if you want, their livelihoods. Now we managed, and I'm saying this because I have built a very good team and a very solid team of technocrats, which talking to students in the UK might seem as the natural thing to do, but unfortunately there is a lot of politics and party politics in Greece that for a long time was equipping ministers' offices with almost solely party members. We managed to go a step further than just making sure that we protected the most vulnerable during COVID times. And this was after Greece, what I tried to briefly mention in the beginning. This was after Greece exited the MOU years, where we had very strict conditionalities in order to receive all the borrowing that we did from the IMF and the European Commission. And these, especially in social policy here in the ministry, were reflected in a very specific way. And I think the number one reform was the consolidation of all benefits in a unified institution, what we call here OPECA. This institution not only unified and solidified all the benefits that were up to the time provided by municipalities, that there was no actually rule of law, basically, in how each municipality was setting the criteria for benefits provision, but also we made sure within the MOU years that we granted new benefits. Guaranteed minimum income was first introduced in Greece in 2014. We introduced in 2018 a benefit for shelters, what we call a housing benefit, which subsidized rent, basically. And this was on top of child benefits that we're handing from the 90s, and of course, disability benefits. So this was the big reform of the MOU years. What we managed to build on top of that during the crisis, and again, I'm saying it with some kind of pride, was that we managed to move simultaneously in two axes. The one was the axis of the most vulnerable, and I can give two examples, and the other was the axis of horizontal reforms, what every person can feel in their everyday life. And I'll try to give one example on that. With regards to the most vulnerable, we targeted very specific cases. For example, abused women and people who were homeless were not beneficiaries of the guaranteed minimum income scheme. This, if you want, incomprehensible injustice that we targeted and we corrected. Similarly, we made a huge reform in the deinstitutionalization of kids. Unfortunately, kids in Greece nowadays still live in closed units, what we called at the time back orphanages. We do not have many orphans in Greece. I mean, it's not the case that used to be a century ago where someone who could not afford it, or a mom who could not afford it, or had a kid out of wedlock, left a basket with a baby in a hospital. That's not the case anymore. Kids in closed units are there because their families have mostly abusive behavior, and someone removes them, the judiciary body removes them from their biological family. So we needed to make sure that we had a transparent system, that we completely reformed the system. And so situations such as each institution selected the parents according to what they thought, and they saw that a couple was younger or richer or blonde or brunette, this was not something that we could accept given the fact that there's horizontal legislation on who is capable on being a foster parent or being adopting a kid. then we needed to make sure that we promoted the whole concept of fostering. Fostering in Greece is not an institution that people know about. Unfortunately, Greece, and this is also, I think, quite related to the nuclear Greek family. Unfortunately, in Greece, people really want to have a kid of their own. We tried to explain what fostering is. For the first time, we handed the horizontal benefits to all foster parents. We enlarged the age for fostering so that from 30 to 60, you can be a foster parent, from 25 to 75. And then we also corrected huge injustices, such as that HIV patients or patients with hepatitis B, even if they're receiving treatment, up to even a month ago, they could not adopt or foster a kid. So we enlarged even the pool of possible candidates for fostering and adoption to make sure that we really engaged into DI. And last thing, and I will end with this, a quick example with the horizontal policies that we engaged and we managed to reform. Key for me, and I think I made it really like a flag, if you want, of my years in this ministry here, is child protection. And you can even see child protection as images on top of my office here. We were one of the first countries that we applied the child guarantee, the European initiative of the child guarantee, which ensures that you have the right set of policies to eliminate child poverty and child exclusion. On top of that, we are making a huge reform on nurseries. Up to now, the state was responsible only for the infrastructural regulation of nurseries and the staffing regulation of nurseries, i.e. making sure that the corridors are wide enough or that you have enough people working, an adequate ratio of people working for each kid that was going in a nursery. Now, for the first time, we are introducing a basic curriculum for all nurseries in order to make sure that the skills of the kids are being developed in a Head Start way so that no child is excluded, so that you get to develop as an individual and not subject to your parents' income, the skills that will make you the most efficient, the most well-working, let's say, within the society and the economy of tomorrow. In this way, we're, and I'll tell you, because I'm talking to academic students here, and I'll tell you how this whole idea came about. I was discussing with a professor one day over breakfast during summer, and he was showing to me a graph that had the difference in skills of the top decile of income distribution and the bottom decile of income distribution kids in the first 6 months of their life. There was a small divergence between the two. And when I asked him, why do you have a divergence of skills development when a baby is 6 months old? He answered to me that it has to do with the nutritious habits of their parents. So I thought that was quite interesting. But when you saw the divergence of the skills development of the richest decile to the poorest decile after 4 years, this divergence had multiplied by a factor of 4. And the reason behind this multiplication is preschool education. So preschool education is key to the development of kids, is key to their later on performance, and it's of course key to the performance of the human capital of an entire economy. So what we do is that we introduced horizontally a curriculum so that no child is going to be left behind, no matter if it comes from a poorer family, from a rural background, from an island background, and also make sure that within this program, we also insert early diagnosis for any kind of disabilities that a kid might show. And as the state, we have the responsibility to make sure that the diagnosis and hence any kind of relevant therapy takes place at the time that it needs to take place. So I'm not sure if I managed to convey some things on what a deputy minister of social affairs does, especially at times of COVID. But if I did not, I'm here to listen to all of your questions and make sure that at least I try to answer to most of them. Thank you.
Dr. Michailidou, dear Minister, you exceeded our expectations, at least from my side, because I don't know if you, you actually realized that at the beginning when you referred to the management, but you very nicely combined, and I think that also my dear colleague Adonios will agree, the social policy with the management background, and you also actually told us that your role is a day-to-day management exercise. And I have a question about that, but
very much so, very, very much so. So, I mean, if someone asks me what it's about, it's like being a huge CEO, that you have thousands of people under management, 5.5 billion euros under management, which I'm not sure how they sound to someone from the UK, but in Greece, it's more than the budget of the whole Ministry of Education, what we have here in social affairs. And even if traditionally it's a job that at least here in Greece is being treated as the profession of someone who belongs to a political party, my 2.5 years of experience here show me that it's a big, big management and a complicated management exercise.
Yeah, and for the public that they don't know, we need to say that Dr. Michailidou was assigned directly from the Prime Minister. Is that right? Please correct me if I'm wrong. So you were not elected in the elections of 2019, but you were assigned directly from the Prime Minister, and because you were also his advisor for such topics. So thank you for now. I will just come back later at the end of the session, and I have also a question. But now I'll hand over to my dear colleague Adonios, who is expert in the comparative social policy, to handle the questions. I will be back later on.
Fantastic. Many thanks, Carlos, and many thanks, Deputy Minister. That's really exciting to have you, and just to extend my gratitude, and just very welcome and very happy to have you today with us. I'm very tempted to ask a couple of questions myself. I just want to say first to all our attendees that you have the opportunity to ask any questions you want on the Q&A function. And you also have the opportunity to vote for any questions that you particularly enjoy or you want to make sure it gets asked. Both myself and Carlos will keep an eye on the questions. And as I will just wait, just to sort of take the opportunity, given your academic background as well, Deputy Minister, and I think it is really important to have, and I'm just, it's really tempting for me to ask the question, really, and you kind of mentioned a lot of the initiatives you've introduced, and I mean, one of the last one, which I think refers to the child guarantee, and if I'm not mistaken, it's a UNICEF project, and I think it includes more countries as well. It's really important to say here that in the Department of Social Policy, we have done a lot of work on the child well-being indicators that UNICEF actually uses, and it goes back to a lot of work has been done by colleagues in the department. So one of the key things I would just like to ask is how far the current, crisis, and I think, as you said, Greece has come out of a very important financial crisis with a lot of austerity. But then we had another crisis, so we are back in the eye of the storm, if you want, once more. How far does this actually create an environment where some of those initiatives become even more, important or perhaps imperative to follow? And whether this, because we like to think of every crisis as also an opportunity, how far the current kind of environment, and in particular something unprecedented as COVID and the pandemic, has basically been helpful in delivering your agenda, or perhaps altering your agenda into different priorities?
Am I answering question by question? Yeah. Okay. So it's a very interesting question, actually, and mostly because this compounded effect of the financial crisis and the public health crisis, of course, can certainly not be an easy one. One of the things that we inherited, if you want, from the financial crisis, and it's something that I'm telling you with complete honesty, I did not expect before coming here, was the severe understaffing of the civil service. For 10 years, we had no new hires. We had incentives for people to live because the civil sector was considered, and in many, many cases was as well, inflated with regards to the number. And if you want, also not just the number, but the quality or the educational level of the civil servants. So the truth is that first, in the institutions or in the civil service of social affairs, We suffered as the rest of the country with regards to understaffing, together with the lack of renewal of the staff that we have, the civil servants. But also, I can tell you the following, that in social affairs and in people working in social affairs, unfortunately, we always have a negative sign of mobility of the civil service. In Greece, we have the mobility of the civil service, so that if someone is a civil servant and wants to work in a different department, he can apply to work to a different department. Each single year, until I came into this office, we had a negative sign for this. Why? Because people entered the civil service in social affairs. It was lower demand to be someone working in an elderly home or in a disability home, because the job is really, really tough. And with the first excuse, or with the first opportunity, if you want, they were moved, or they were asking to be moved, and eventually moved in other services, either in the local authorities mostly, but if it was within the ministry, it was always in an administrative position. So we have this huge understaffing and people working in administrative positions that are not even suitable to work in admin positions. So you might have an elderly home with 200 people working, and 120 of them could be in admin positions. And there's not much you can do about it, especially given the fact that the non-attrition rule in the civil service still applies. Now, with regard to the opportunities that arose within COVID, and I'll tell you the challenge on them as well. With regards to the opportunities, there was a lot of digitalization, and digitalization that was needed as a result of lack of ability for physical contact. So, for example, in the efforts that we make on deinstitutionalization, for 4 years now, a prerequisite for someone to foster or to adopt a kid was by law to have state education, state classes, state lessons, right? For 4 years now, they were never ever organized. So from the one hand, the state was telling you, I really need you to get trained by me in order to adopt a kid. From the other side, though, the state never provided these lessons. We made sure that we started these lessons within the pandemic, and we digitally trained the trainers. And then we had, and we still have, every 2 months in all of the country, in each different geographic periphery, trainings or potential parents and foster parents. So it was an opportunity that came as a result of a necessity to digitize and digitalize services and provisions, because otherwise you could not have any kind of continuity of service provision. However, given and this is where the challenge is, given the density of the problems, and given the sheer volume of the problems that needed to be faced during the pandemic, especially in this ministry to make sure that people don't die, we are several times missing the opportunity to make these changes structural. And what do I mean by that is to make this a procedure rather than a one-off case. So I'll tell you what I mean by that. For example, we needed to we managed to prioritize the vaccination of the elderly and the people with disabilities within the first month, January that the vaccine was available. We did so not just by prioritizing them in our lists, but also by making sure that special convoys went in all over the country to find the elderly and the disabled within their own closed unit. How did we do that? We had to collect all the, let's say, NHS numbers of these people. But in order to do so, we did not have them. What happened was that during Christmas, literally my office here was transformed into a call center. And even my director here was calling, and all of my team was calling all elderly and disability homes. And when we're talking about elderly homes in Greece, I need to remind people, or people don't even know, that 1/3 of elderly homes are run by the church, and they do not even have computers. So how would we get the NHS insurance number of people whose management doesn't even have computers to store these national insurance numbers, and hence have the numbers of their national insurance together with the numbers of the national insurance of their judicial representatives, because many of the times these people have dementia, so they cannot do it for themselves. So my office here became a huge call center that created this database that the state did not have at the time. So we have a huge Excel basically with hundreds of thousands of NIS numbers. However, we did not manage yet to make this sustainable because we are almost a year after, and this is not, it's an Excel. It's not a dynamic platform that when people die, their number is erased from the file, and each new intake within each elderly home within the whole country. And why? Because the sheer volume of what we had to do did not allow us at the same time of making this, procuring with the national legislation of procurement that is so restrictive that it would need to take 2 years if we have any kind of national procurement that has a budget of over 60,000 euros to make it in a sustainable way. So we have moved a lot. We have leaped several things for decades, if you want, but we have missed opportunities to transform those. I mean, perhaps I'm not a great politician to say what we have missed, but to transform them into structural changes.
Fantastic. I think that's really important in terms of the resources created in the response and how, and I think some of the questions actually follow up on this, and I think they're kind of, we have actually quite a few by now. And one of the questions, I think Abby was the first one. I'm just going to follow up. I think the first question has been already asked pretty much. I think we had the same question. The second one is how far, again, the crisis here might have been an opportunity to implement reforms that otherwise would provoke serious resistance from the public or perhaps even the opposition, I would add. So how far does the environment, the political environment of the crisis provided an opportunity here? Yeah, if you want. Yeah.
No, I'm afraid I lost the sentence up to the opportunity here. I'm not sure.
Okay. I'm very happy to repeat. So basically, Abby is asking how far, in this kind of moments of crisis, the opportunity to implement reforms perhaps is easier, because otherwise it might have provoked serious resistance from the public or the opposition.
That's true. It's easier with regards to the resistance. It's easier as, I mean, we've seen it as well. We've seen it in social affairs. We are able to impose things that we would not have done otherwise. So what do I mean by that? I mean, it's still not easy, but at least it's easier. We have much more solid monitoring and control mechanisms. There was a lot of political and stakeholder pressure to abstain from such controls and monitoring, but now it's much easier, because otherwise you're thinking that you will expose them and you will have absolutely no second thought about exposing anyone who is resistant to monitoring. One of the things, together with this new curriculum that we are making for all nurseries, given the fact that the state funds in a means-tested way families, especially mothers, with vouchers to take their kids into nurseries, and something like 40% of mothers in Greece do get vouchers for their kids to send them into nurseries. Given the fact that this money is state money and also European money as well, we are saying that within the new reform that we're doing, we're also having electronic presences or absences. So each mom or each grandma or whoever it is, every time that they send their kids to nursery, as they do with their COVID pass, they will show the thing, and we will make sure that for nurseries, but also for what we call centers for creative occupation, that kids of primary school go after school, and they're also paid by the state. We will know who actually goes there, and we will make sure that we do not have phenomena such that the owners of these places abuse state money, right? We still have quite a lot of resistance, but I'm not sure, maybe you two are Greeks and will remember that. But when electronic prescription was implemented in Greece about 10 years ago, all doctors were actually complaining that they do not know this expression, we don't know computers, hence we cannot have electronic subscription. So what the state did back a decade ago was to provide computers to all these people, pay for the computers, and then ultimately only half of them use them. Now this excuse is not really legit, because even after the capital controls, when even grandparents needed to go to banks and electronically transfer money, and now with COVID that many things happen digitally, then this excuse for resistance is certainly not valid, and it's something that you can somehow turn as boomerang and expose the one who resists in such change.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. I think, I mean, the next question we have slightly kind of focuses more on how perhaps the response to the pandemic has been unique to Greece in relation to Europe. So Owen here suggests that it seems to be that the COVID response has been more based on, particular, if you want, national responses. And they seem to be more influential in a sense from European thinking. I would also add that there are a few similarities, because I've done some research on this. I mean, in terms of the furlough schemes and the Kurzarbeit from Germany, seem to be a very, clear policy kind of response across most of the European countries, in fact. But could you sort of perhaps highlight whether you think you kind of followed to some extent some of the blueprints that perhaps were, offered by the EU or other countries, and how far perhaps the response might be also unique to Greece?
I think that the response of Greece was certainly a change of paradigm with regards to how the rest perceive Greece with regards to public administration. So from being the scapegoats, if you want, of Europe, I think that we managed to portray that we managed the whole crisis with severe responsibility. And also some of the things that we did here first were implemented in a European level. So we were the ones, or Greece was the one that suggested to have the European pass. So to end this absurd thing of each country having its own different pass and admin documents when you cross borders, to have a single pass within Europe so that it's going to make people's lives easier. Same thing with what we did now with regards to compulsory vaccination. Only a week ago, a measure for compulsory vaccination of people over 60 years old was announced. We were the first country in Europe, several seem to be following, including Germany, the way that each country is doing it is different, but we were the first to impose compulsory vaccination to people over the age of 60, because this is where the highest risk factor is, and this is where the ER rooms are getting really crowded by people from these ages. And the way that we are applying this is by an automatic deduction by the tax authorities of 100 euros a month from people's accounts. So there are things that Greece did first and the rest of Europe followed. And there are things, of course, that as Professor Rubakis suggested, that Greece is going with the flow, and there is a common, homogeneous response. This has to do, of course, with the furlough schemes. It also has to do with subsidizing, rather than choosing, if you want, the American model of higher unemployment. The European model was very much based on subsidizing wages and making sure that people did not lose income within these months or within these years, actually. So there was a lot of homogeneity in our response, but also some things that we managed to engage into first that I think that proved good examples for the rest of the European countries to follow. And of course, and I'm saying it again and again, I think that not because I'm managing this ministry here, but I think that our response in protecting the most vulnerable was a very responsible lesson for the rest of Europe.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to say that Greece has been one of the countries that was actually least heat, basically. I think during especially the first wave, I think probably the lowest number of losses across Europe. And just to follow up on what you were saying, Deputy Minister, I think we have a question here that refers to some of this expansion in terms of the social policy interventions that were introduced during COVID response. And there are two questions, and I'm trying to sort of summarize them here. One is, how far do you intend to think that those interventions, in particular supporting people who might be exposed, and those could be, for example, homeless, those could be the children, are likely to remain? And in a sense, also, how far are they sustainable, given some of the the issues around public debt that continue to be, of course, problematic, not only in terms of the growth, but mostly sometimes on how EU governance might approach those things. So the physical constraints, I guess, is the second point here, and whether you intend to continue some of those services and interventions you have introduced.
Well, it's a very legitimate question, because our public debt now is at very, very high levels again. But the thing is that, especially in the Ministry of Social Affairs here, in the Deputy Ministry of Social Affairs, most of the things that we managed to do on top of COVID were structural reforms, have to do with changes that are in the core of the operation of services, rather than increasing budgets here and there. There was this increase of budgets with regards to specific and targeted injections to make sure that people did not lose the income and then did not have their livelihoods diminish. But these were completely COVID related, and they're already they're already very much in the phasing out stage. Now, with regards to what we did in social policy, was that we made very specific injections of cash. That was especially in the beneficiaries of the guaranteed minimum income scheme, that for the last 1 year, we have injected 3 special injections of doubling their benefit. The 2 injections were at the times of the lockdowns, and then we now have a special one coming this Christmas. But they do not change the structure of the distribution. They are targeted injections, which they are not periodic, hence they do not create the feeling of something being permanent. They are targeted, and I mean, I can reassure you, but I mean, at least it's certainly my feeling that no one perceives them as changes that are here to stay. I mean, we are making sure that when it comes to injecting assistance, financial assistance, we demonstrate where the need is, who is in need, and the temporary character of each injection.
Okay, we have a lot of questions, and I'm very thankful for all attendees for posting those questions, and I really have to apologize for not having enough time to address all of those questions. But as a final question,
next time we'll do this in person. I'm very excited to come back.
We will look forward to it, and both on behalf.
But I need to ask where the building is. Is it in East Heslington, or is it in the old campus?
Very close to Alcuin, where probably you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was at Alcuin, and economics was at Alcuin as well. So great.
Yeah, it's very close. It's just behind Alcuin, so it would be a familiar neighborhood, I think, definitely. And the final question, given your focus on children, I think it relates to the issues around COVID, and we know that COVID had a very big impact, for example, on child both learning and mental, if you want, developments, mental health issues, and of course the opportunity for children to play, to go out, to do the things that children do, but also participate in education. So what would be, if you want, your answer, or perhaps your vision for overcoming some of those challenges that children faced? And that will be the last question.
Well, it's a tough one, so I'm glad it's the last question. I'm not sure if there is much we can do to compensate for the effect of the lockdown on the actual lack of children's activity. It's something that it's hard to quantify. It was certainly a negative blow with, unfortunately, negative multipliers. What I think is interesting, and I was just discussing now that there was a seminar that we housed here in the Ministry of the WHO on the effects of COVID in disability and in kids with disability, has to do with a debate or the intellectual exercise, if you want, of kids and the effectiveness of teleworking or teleeducation, and whether this is teleeducation for kids of typical development or of kids with disabilities. There, I think that three things that we can quickly say is that teleworking or teleeducation worked. Second, that it worked, but it's certainly not the same as physical interaction. But then also that it was very specific in managing two things, in managing the sense of isolation of kids, that especially when they're really used to physical activity to a degree that they don't know what to do with their own bodies, and even more so kids with disability, then the teleworking or teleeducation was a remedy in order to engage with some of this feeling of isolation. And second, that it was a kind of remedy for the anguish and the anxiety that kids and kids with disability have given or had given the lack of physical activity. I think that what this whole experience with COVID showed to us was that schools, whether these are disability schools or mixed schools or schools for kids of typical development, they really need to, their closure needs to be heavily considered. And what we need, because even here in Greece as well, we passed several models of closing the school first or opening the school first, right? We passed from the two extremes. And I think that now, even psychologically, one can assert that the feeling of lockdown to kids had so many multipliers, negative multipliers, that it really needs to be well thought when next applied, and make sure that we exhaust all space before engaging into the same kind of decision again.
Great. Adonis, you're on mute, but I guess you want to thank.
Just thank you. Yes, thank you very much.
So we reached the end. I mean, time flies, especially for this session. Deputy Minister Dr. Michailidou, I would like again, on behalf of the Management School and the Social Policy and Social Work Department, to thank you for accepting our invitation, for taking the time to be with us today. It was a very insightful session. I have a question, but I will save it for next time when we will invite you again for a face-to-face session.
I hope so. I mean it. I'm not saying it to be polite. I'm very much looking forward to it.
This is noted. So again, thank you so much. Thanks everyone. Thanks, of course, also my dear colleague, Dr. Adonis Zoubakis, for an excellent moderation and handling of the questions. And I think what I will take away from this session today is that without having any prior communication, you so nicely captured both the management dimension and the social policy dimension of your agenda. So you actually talked about two topics that are very relevant to all of our colleagues and departments and students and our wider public. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you. I really mean it that it's a management exercise, and it all comes down to your team. I mean, it was very hard for me to form a team. Now I have a very good one. I exhaust them. So many people cannot take the responsibilities, but it's a team exercise, very much so.
Yes,
thank you very much both for the question and the time and everything. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. And this was our last masterclass. Have all a great Christmas break, and yeah, enjoy the festive season. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Bye.